Christopher Columbus, the Genoese explorer whose voyages across the Atlantic beginning in 1492 initiated a permanent exchange between the Old and New Worlds, ended his life in a state of disillusionment. Despite his monumental achievements, his final years were marked by a struggle to reclaim the titles and wealth he had been promised by the Spanish crown. After his fourth and final voyage, he returned to Spain in 1504, physically ill with reactive arthritis and mentally exhausted. He spent his last months following the royal court, petitioning King Ferdinand to restore his governorship of the Indies and grant his family the riches he believed they were owed. His appeals were largely ignored, and he grew increasingly frail. On May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus died in the city of Valladolid, Spain, at the age of around 55. The exact cause of his death is believed to be a heart attack resulting from his chronic illness. His death went largely unnoticed in Spain. There was no grand state funeral for the man who had given the kingdom a vast empire. He was initially buried with little ceremony in a Franciscan monastery in Valladolid. The journey of Columbus's remains after his death, however, is an epic saga in itself, far more complex than that of any other explorer. Around 1509, his son Diego had his father's body moved to a family mausoleum at a monastery in Seville. Yet, Columbus had expressed a wish to be buried in the New World. In 1542, complying with the will of Diego's widow, the remains of both Columbus and his son were exhumed and shipped across the Atlantic to the island of Hispaniola. They were interred in the Cathedral of Santo Domingo, in what is now the Dominican Republic. There they rested for over 2 centuries. In 1795, when Spain ceded Hispaniola to France, the Spanish decided to move the great admiral's remains to keep them on Spanish soil. They excavated a lead box from the cathedral, presumed to contain Columbus, and moved it to Havana, Cuba. In 1898, after the Spanish-American War, the box was moved again, this time back across the Atlantic to Seville. It was placed within a spectacular monument inside the Seville Cathedral, where it remains today. The tomb is a massive bronze catafalque, held aloft on the shoulders of 4 giant figures representing the 4 kingdoms of Spain during Columbus's life: Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre. But the story has a final twist. In 1877, during restoration work at the cathedral in Santo Domingo, a different lead box was discovered. It was inscribed with the words, "The illustrious and excellent man, Don Colon, Admiral of the Ocean Sea." Dominican authorities have always insisted that the Spanish took the wrong body in 1795, and that the true remains of Columbus never left the island. They built a massive cross-shaped lighthouse and mausoleum, the Faro a Colon, to house the remains they possess. To this day, both Seville and Santo Domingo claim to hold the authentic bones of Christopher Columbus, leaving the final resting place of the world's most famous explorer, a subject of enduring mystery and international debate. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese explorer sailing for Spain, conceived and led the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe. Setting out in 1519, his fleet of 5 ships aimed to find a westward route to the Spice Islands of Indonesia. The voyage was one of history's most arduous and remarkable feats of navigation, involving mutinies, starvation, disease, and the discovery of the treacherous strait at the tip of South America that now bears his name. Magellan successfully crossed the vast, unknown ocean he christened the Pacific, but he would not live to complete the journey. In the spring of 1521, the expedition reached the islands that would later be named the Philippines. There, Magellan became embroiled in a local political conflict, attempting to convert the chieftain of Cebu, Raja Humabon, to Christianity. As a demonstration of his power and faith, Magellan agreed to lead a small force of his men to subdue Humabon's rival, Lapu-Lapu, on the nearby island of Mactan. The decision was a fatal miscalculation. On the morning of April 27th, 1521, Magellan and about 50 of his men waded ashore to confront Lapu-Lapu's force, which vastly outnumbered them. The Spanish soldiers, weighed down by armor and unable to get their ship's cannons close enough to shore, were quickly overwhelmed by a barrage of spears and poisoned arrows. According to the expedition's chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, who was an eyewitness, Magellan fought bravely at the front, was wounded multiple times, and was eventually surrounded and killed by Lapu-Lapu's warriors. He died on the beach, a world away from home, his grand voyage unfinished. After the battle, the victorious Mactanese warriors took Magellan's body as a war trophy. The surviving members of the expedition desperately tried to ransom their captain's remains, offering a substantial amount of merchandise, but Lapu-Lapu refused. The body of Ferdinand Magellan was never recovered. He has no grave, no tomb, no final resting place. His bones were lost to history on the shores of the island where he fell. The expedition continued under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, who finally completed the circumnavigation, returning to Spain in 1522. While Magellan's physical remains are lost, his legacy is marked across the globe. There are monuments to him in his native Portugal and in Spain, but perhaps the most poignant memorials are celestial. The two dwarf galaxies visible from the southern hemisphere known as the Magellanic Clouds. A fittingly grand and distant tribute to the explorer who died trying to encircle the world. Captain James Cook was a British explorer, navigator, and cartographer whose 3 voyages to the Pacific Ocean fundamentally redrew the map of the world. He was the first European to make contact with the eastern coastline of Australia and the Hawaiian Islands, and his expeditions were the first to circumnavigate New Zealand and Antarctica. His meticulous charting of unknown lands and his scientific approach to exploration set a new standard for those who followed. On his 3rd voyage, in search of the elusive Northwest Passage, Cook and his ships, the HMS Resolution and HMS Discovery, returned to the Hawaiian Islands in January of 1779 for rest and reprovisioning. Initially, their arrival coincided with a festival for the god Lono, and the islanders treated Cook and his men with a reverence bordering on worship. However, relations soured over time as the British stayed longer, taxing the islanders' resources and patience. After leaving, the ships were forced to return to Kealakekua Bay to repair a damaged mast, an inopportune return that broke the Hawaiians' belief in Cook's divine status. Tensions escalated rapidly. After a small boat was stolen by the islanders, Cook decided to take a hostage to force its return, a common practice for him. On the morning of February 14, 1779, he went ashore with a party of Royal Marines to try and lure the ruling chief Kalani Opu'u to his ship. A large and angry crowd gathered on the beach. A scuffle broke out, a shot was fired, and in the ensuing chaos, Captain Cook was struck on the head and then stabbed to death by the islanders as he tried to retreat to the water's edge. He was 50 years old. In the aftermath, a tense truce was negotiated. In a sign of respect for a great chief, the Hawaiians took Cook's body and performed their traditional funerary rituals, which involved dismembering the body, baking the flesh off the bones, and preserving the bones as sacred relics. Days later, under pressure from the British, the islanders returned some of Cook's remains to his crew in a bundle. What was left of Captain James Cook was placed in a weighted coffin and, with full military honors, buried at sea in Kealakekua Bay on February 22, 1779. There is no grave to visit. His final resting place is the Pacific Ocean he did so much to reveal to the world. A simple white obelisk, erected by the British in 1874, stands on the shoreline near the spot where he fell. The land on which the monument sits was deeded to the United Kingdom, and it remains the only piece of British sovereign territory in the United States, a quiet and remote memorial to one of history's greatest explorers. Marco Polo was a Venetian merchant and explorer whose travels in the late 13th century along the Silk Road became one of the most celebrated journeys in history. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, introduced Europeans to the vast and mysterious cultures of Central Asia and China, detailing the wealth and power of Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire. After spending 24 years away from home, he returned to Venice in 1295. He later commanded a galley in a war against Venice's rival, Genoa, was captured, and dictated his famous travelogue to a fellow prisoner. After his release, he lived the rest of his life in Venice as a wealthy merchant, a husband, and a father. He did not embark on any further great adventures, settling into a comfortable life in his home city. In his old age, Marco Polo was confined to his bed with illness. He died at his home in Venice on January 8, 1324, at the age of around 70. As he lay on his deathbed, surrounded by family, he was reportedly urged to retract the fables he had written in his book. According to tradition, his famous last words were, "I have not told half of what I saw." In his will, he left a substantial inheritance to his wife and daughters, and in a final act of compassion, freed a Tartar servant who had accompanied him from Asia. In accordance with his wishes, he was buried in the Church of San Lorenzo in the Castello district of Venice, the parish church where his father had also been laid to rest. For centuries, his tomb was a site of interest, a tangible link to the city's most famous traveler. However, the church he was buried in underwent a major reconstruction in 1592. During this extensive rebuilding, the original sarcophagus containing Marco Polo's remains was lost. Its exact location within the church grounds was not properly documented, and despite searches over the years, it has never been found. Today, the Church of San Lorenzo still stands in Venice, but there is no tomb or grand monument to visit. The final resting place of the man who opened the eyes of the West to the wonders of the East is unmarked and unknown. Its location a historical mystery hidden somewhere beneath the stones of his beloved home city. Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese nobleman, secured his place in history by becoming the first European to reach India by sea. His initial voyage, from 1497 to 1499, was a masterpiece of navigation and endurance that successfully rounded Africa's Cape of Good Hope and established a direct maritime route to the lucrative spice markets of the East. This achievement effectively bypassed the old overland trade routes and positioned Portugal as a dominant force in a new age of global trade and colonial expansion. Da Gama made a second, more violent voyage to India and later retired, living as a wealthy and powerful advisor to the Portuguese king. In 1524, he was called out of retirement by King John III to return to India as its viceroy to combat growing corruption among the Portuguese officials there. He arrived in Goa, India, in the autumn of 1524, but his third tenure in the land he had opened to Europe would be tragically short. He soon fell ill, likely with malaria, and his health declined rapidly. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1524, Vasco da Gama died in the city of Cochin, far from his home. He was buried with honors in the St. Francis Church in Cochin, the first European church built in India. He was initially laid to rest in a simple tomb within the church. His body remained there for 14 years. However, it was his wish to be buried in his homeland. In 1538, his remains were exhumed and repatriated to Portugal. They were interred in a chapel in Videgueira, the town where he had held the title of count. There they remained for over 3 centuries. In 1880, in a grand national gesture to honor the heroes of Portugal's Age of Discovery, his remains were moved one last time. They were transferred to the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon, a magnificent building whose construction was funded by the profits from da Gama's first voyage. His tomb is located in the lower chancel of the monastery's church, directly opposite the tomb of Portugal's great national poet, Luís Vaz de Camões, who had immortalized da Gama's voyages in his epic poem, The Lusíads. The tomb is a spectacular work of art, a massive stone sarcophagus carved in the ornate Manueline style, adorned with nautical motifs like ropes, armillary spheres, and the cross of the Order of Christ. It is a suitably grand and final resting place for the navigator whose daring voyage transformed the map of world trade and sealed the legacy of Portugal as a global maritime power. Sir Francis Drake was an English sea captain, privateer, and explorer, renowned for his circumnavigation of the world in a single expedition from 1577 to 1580. He was a celebrated hero in England for his raids against Spanish ships and colonies, which brought immense wealth to the English crown, and he played a key role as vice admiral in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Known to the Spanish as El Draque, or the Dragon, he was one of the most feared and daring figures of his era. His final expedition, however, was a disastrous failure. In 1595, he set sail with a large fleet for the West Indies, aiming to capture Spanish treasure in Panama. But the Spanish were now better prepared, and the English forces suffered a series of defeats and heavy losses. The campaign was plagued by disease, disorganization, and a lack of the spectacular success that had defined Drake's earlier career. As the fleet lay at anchor off the coast of Portobelo, Panama, an epidemic of dysentery swept through the ships. Drake, like many of his men, contracted the brutal illness. After several weeks of suffering, Sir Francis Drake died aboard his flagship, the Defiance, in the early morning hours of January 28, 1596. He was around 55 years old. Following his wishes and the naval traditions of the time, he was afforded a hero's burial at sea. His body was dressed in his full suit of armor, sealed in a lead coffin, and committed to the deep. The ship's trumpeters sounded a final salute, and the cannons fired in his honor. To prevent the Spanish from finding his ships, his crew scuttled two of their own vessels nearby before sailing for home. His final resting place is the ocean floor, somewhere in the waters off the coast of Portobelo, Panama. There is no grave or monument marking the spot. For centuries, divers and treasure hunters have searched for his lead-lined coffin, but it has never been found. The man who had sailed around the world, claiming new lands and terrorizing the Spanish Main, was ultimately claimed by the sea itself. His legacy is celebrated in England with numerous statues and memorials, but his body remains in its watery grave, a lost tomb for one of history's most audacious maritime adventurers. Roald Amundsen was a Norwegian polar explorer, a master of planning and execution who achieved a series of historic firsts. He was the first person to traverse the Northwest Passage, the first to reach the South Pole in 1911, and a leader of the first expedition confirmed to have reached the North Pole in 1926, making him the first person to have reached both poles. He was a towering figure in the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, known for his meticulous preparation and his embrace of Inuit survival techniques, which gave him a decisive edge over his rivals, most notably Robert Falcon Scott. After conquering the poles, Amundsen settled into a quieter life but was never far from the world of exploration. In the spring of 1928, his former rival and fellow explorer, the Italian airman Umberto Nobile, went missing along with the crew of his airship, the Italia, after it crashed in the Arctic Ocean north of Svalbard. Despite a history of animosity between the two men, Amundsen did not hesitate to join the international rescue effort. On June 18, 1928, Roald Amundsen and a crew of 5 others took off from Tromsø, Norway, aboard a French flying boat, the Latham 47. Their mission was to search for Nobile and his missing men. Shortly after taking off, the aircraft sent a final radio message and then disappeared without a trace in the vicinity of Bear Island in the Barents Sea. An extensive search was launched, but no sign of the plane or its crew was found, aside from a single detached float and a small gasoline tank that washed ashore weeks later. Roald Amundsen, the man who had so carefully planned every detail of his own expeditions to survive the world's harshest environments, vanished while on a risky and selfless mission to save another. He was 55 years old. Nobile and some of his crew were eventually found and rescued by other teams. Roald Amundsen has no grave. His body, along with those of his crewmates, was never recovered from the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean. The sea that he had so expertly navigated became his final resting place. Numerous memorials around the world honor his memory, from statues in his native Norway to the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica. His name is written across the polar maps, but his tomb is the vast, unforgiving Arctic he dedicated his life to exploring. Hernán Cortés was the Spanish conquistador who, with a small army of soldiers and a crucial alliance with indigenous peoples, led the expedition that caused the fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521. His conquest of Mexico secured vast lands and incredible wealth for the Spanish crown, and fundamentally reshaped the course of history in the Americas. Despite this monumental achievement, Cortés, much like Columbus, spent his later years feeling unappreciated and embittered. He fell out of favor with the Spanish king, who feared he was becoming too powerful and was stripped of his authority as governor of New Spain. He returned to Spain in 1541 to plead his case before the court, but was met with indifference. He never returned to the land he had conquered. Cortés spent his final years in a state of relative obscurity near Seville, Spain. He died on December 2nd, 1547, from pleurisy, at the age of 62. In his will, he had requested to be buried in Mexico. This wish set in motion a posthumous journey for his remains that spanned centuries and continents. He was first buried in a mausoleum in a monastery near Seville. In 1566, his remains were exhumed and, as he had wished, shipped across the Atlantic to New Spain. They were interred in a church in Texcoco. In 1629, they were moved again, this time to a Franciscan church in Mexico City. They were moved once more in 1794 to a magnificent new tomb within the Hospital de Jesús Nazareno, a hospital in Mexico City that Cortés himself had founded. There they remained until the Mexican War of Independence in the early 19th century. With anti-Spanish sentiment running high, there were fears his tomb would be desecrated. In 1823, his remains were secretly removed by a historian and hidden. For over a century, their location was a closely guarded secret. It was not until 1946 that the bones were rediscovered, hidden within a wall at the very same hospital. After being authenticated, they were returned to a new, much simpler resting place. Today, the remains of Hernán Cortés are interred in a modest, unmarked niche in the wall of the Church of Jesús Nazareno in Mexico City, the same hospital he founded. A simple bronze plaque on the wall nearby simply states his name and dates, a deliberately understated final resting place for one of history's most consequential and controversial figures. Sir Ernest Shackleton was an Anglo-Irish Antarctic explorer whose name has become synonymous with extraordinary leadership and survival against impossible odds. While he never achieved his ultimate goals of reaching the South Pole or crossing Antarctica, his fame rests on the incredible story of his 1914 to 1916 Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. When his ship, the Endurance, was trapped and crushed by pack ice, he led his 27 men on a grueling journey over sea ice and through treacherous waters to safety, a feat involving a legendary 800-mile open boat journey and a trek across the mountains of South Georgia Island, all without losing a single man from his core party. Despite the immense physical and mental toll of this ordeal, Shackleton's desire for the Antarctic was not extinguished. In 1921, he embarked on another expedition, the Shackleton-Rowett expedition, with the less defined goal of circumnavigating the Antarctic continent. The expedition was troubled from the start, and Shackleton himself was not in good health. He had been warned by doctors about a heart condition but ignored their advice. On January 4th, 1922, his ship, the Quest, arrived at the island of South Georgia, the very same island where his Endurance saga had reached its triumphant conclusion years earlier. That night, aboard the ship, Shackleton suffered a massive heart attack. According to the expedition's physician, his last words, in response to being told to lead a more regular life, were, "You are always wanting me to give up things. What is it I ought to give up?" He died moments later, early on the morning of January 5th, 1922. He was 47 years old. His body was prepared for transport back to England for a state funeral. However, when the ship carrying him reached Montevideo, Uruguay, a message was waiting from his wife, Emily. She insisted that her husband's final resting place should be in the South, the place he loved most. The body was returned to South Georgia. On March 5th, 1922, Sir Ernest Shackleton was buried in the Norwegian Lutheran Cemetery in Grytviken, the island's main whaling station. His grave is marked by a rough-hewn granite headstone, and it faces south, towards the Antarctic continent he could never conquer but which had defined his life. It is a tradition for visitors to his grave to pour a small amount of whiskey on the ground and toast, "To the Boss," a fitting tribute at a lonely and poignant resting place for one of the polar region's most heroic figures. Meriwether Lewis, along with his co-captain William Clark, led the legendary Corps of Discovery expedition from 1804 to 1806, the first American expedition to cross the western portion of the United States. Commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, Their journey to the Pacific Ocean and back was a triumph of exploration and science, mapping new territory, establishing trade with Native American tribes, and documenting hundreds of new species of plants and animals. Upon his return, Lewis was celebrated as a national hero and was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory. However, his life after the expedition was fraught with difficulty. He proved to be a poor administrator, fell into debt, and struggled with what contemporaries described as bouts of melancholy, likely a form of depression and possible alcoholism. In the autumn of 1809, at the age of 35, Lewis set out from his post in St. Louis for Washington, D.C., to resolve financial disputes related to his governorship. He traveled along the notoriously dangerous Natchez Trace, a remote road running through the wilderness of Tennessee. On the evening of October 10th, he stopped for the night at a remote inn called Grinder's Stand. The next morning, he was found dead from 2 gunshot wounds, one to the head and one to the chest. The innkeeper's wife, the only witness, gave a confusing and contradictory account of hearing gunshots and Lewis crawling around his room, begging for water. His death was officially ruled a suicide, a conclusion supported by his friend Thomas Jefferson, who noted Lewis's history of sensible depressions of mind. However, compelling evidence has led many historians to believe he may have been murdered for his money or for political reasons. The true circumstances of his death remain one of American history's most enduring mysteries. Because he died in such a remote area, Meriwether Lewis was buried just a few hundred yards from the inn where he died. His grave was initially marked by a simple wooden fence. In 1848, the state of Tennessee erected a monument over his grave. It is a striking and symbolic structure, a tall, deliberately broken column made of limestone, meant to represent a life cut short in its prime. Today, the gravesite is the centerpiece of the Meriwether Lewis National Monument on the Natchez Trace Parkway, a lonely and solemn memorial to a great American explorer whose final chapter is shrouded in tragedy and uncertainty. John Cabot, born Giovanni Caboto in Italy, was a Venetian navigator and explorer who, sailing under the commission of King Henry VII of England, made a landmark voyage in 1497. On this journey, aboard the small ship Matthew, he became the first European since the Vikings to make a documented landing on the coast of North America. Though he believed he had reached the northeastern shores of Asia, his discovery of what was likely Newfoundland or Cape Breton Island formed the basis for England's later claims to Canada and the North American continent. He returned to England a hero, celebrated for finding a new, shorter route across the Atlantic and for discovering rich fishing grounds that would become immensely valuable. The king was thrilled and quickly authorized a much larger, more ambitious second expedition. In May of 1498, John Cabot set sail from Bristol, England, with a fleet of 5 ships. The goal of this voyage was to press further west from his initial landing spot, to explore the coast, and to find a route to Japan. The ships were loaded with merchandise for trade, and the expectation of great discoveries was high. One of the 5 ships was damaged in a storm shortly after departure and was forced to dock in Ireland. The other 4 ships, with John Cabot leading the way, continued west into the vast Atlantic. They were never seen or heard from again. The entire expedition, including its famous leader, vanished without a trace. No wreckage was ever found, no messages in a bottle, no definitive accounts from indigenous peoples. The fate of John Cabot is a complete and total mystery. Historians have proposed numerous theories over the centuries. Perhaps the fleet was sunk in a massive storm. Perhaps they reached North America but perished from starvation or in conflicts with native populations. Some theories suggest they were lost trying to navigate through the icy waters of the Arctic. There is no death date, no final account, and certainly no grave. John Cabot simply disappeared from the historical record. His final resting place is unknown, presumed to be somewhere at the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean. Unlike explorers who were buried at sea with ceremony, his end is a blank page. There are statues honoring him in Bristol, England, and in Newfoundland, Canada, but these are merely monuments to his discovery. His tomb is the ocean itself, an unmarked and undiscovered grave for the man who claimed a new world for England and then vanished into it.